Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, co-founder and vice president for research at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. The ANWA Deterrence Center is a 501c3 organization ensuring a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrent and its ongoing modernization. Thank you for listening and welcome to the show. The views of the host and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to another episode of NucleCast. Of course, I'm your host, Adam Lowther, and this is episode 2 of our discussion with Tom Ramos. He wrote a book here recently, From Berkeley to Berlin, so pick it up if you don't have it. And it's a look at these early years in the development of America's nuclear arsenal. And it looks at the labs and the scientists and who was involved. And Tom, he spent his career at Livermore, so he's lived a lot of this, but then he went back even further beyond his career. And so we talked a lot in the first episode about Oppenheimer and what was true and what wasn't true. And then the one question that we didn't really answer in episode 1, because I want to get to January 1961, when Kennedy comes to power, and then sort of this buildup of the arsenals, and Livermore starts to play a big important role, and we get the division of who's developing what warheads and this competition between labs. But so recently Oppenheimer was essentially, exonerated. He was, what's that?
Canonized.
Yeah. So my question for you is, the sort of the end of the movie's this very challenging, he's railroaded, but in reality, you and I both held the appropriate clearances as well. And I cannot imagine that either one of us would have been granted a clearance with a similar background. So, for Oppenheimer, I think even Edward Teller says in the movie, he is an American that loves this country. And I don't think anybody really doubts that, but it's the question of access to highly classified information and the ability to sort of maintain that classified information in a secure manner. So can you maybe give a little bit of insight on this, this investigation that ultimately led to the denial of Oppenheimer's clearance? Was this a railroading of Oppenheimer, or was it something different?
Okay. I think if I can take it logically, it starts with when Oppenheimer accepts the position from Dick Rose to start a laboratory. He has to recruit the best scientists he can in America. And at the top of his list is Enrico Fermi, probably one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century. And he does. And Fermi says, yeah, I'd be happy to join you, but I'd like you to also invite my good friend Edward Teller. And Teller and Fermi met and started a fairly strong friendship in 1933. And that went for years throughout the 1930s. And and they had worked together when Fermi also helped to get Teller into America out of Nazi Germany. Anyway, Fermi asked Teller, "Do you think it's possible you can use an atomic bomb to initiate fusion reactions, what we now call thermonuclear reactions, that would make for an even larger bomb?" And Teller thought about it, and he came back and says, "I think it's possible." And he called that new kind of bomb the super bomb. And so Teller had the utmost admiration for Fermi, as frankly any physicist in that day would. And so it became almost like an obsession with Teller to try to figure out how would you make this super to work. And when he got to Los Alamos, Oppenheimer gave him permission to create a group that would start designing this super. And Teller did, but they didn't make Teller did create this group. They didn't make much progress during the war. And towards the end of the war, Oppenheimer went in and told Teller he's disbanding that effort. We're not going to do that anymore. And Teller was extraordinarily disenchanted. He went to Fermi to seek his help, but the war was ending, and Fermi went back to Chicago, where he created a nuclear science institute. And Teller, in frustration, quits Los Alamos, and he goes up and he joins Fermi up in Chicago. But then the new director, Norris Bradbury, becomes the new director of Los Alamos. He calls up Teller and he asks him to come back to Los Alamos and to reignite work on the thermonuclear weapon. And Teller agrees, and he goes back to Los Alamos, and Teller then forms a group with very prominent members. He could not get a lot of members within Los Alamos, turns out, because of I think, in my opinion, the influence that Oppenheimer had as he left. And he told the people at Los Alamos, it's immoral to work on that. And many of them, he was quite a hero. Many of them took that seriously. And so there was not that much.
Why didn't Oppenheimer stay and continue to run Los Alamos and turn it into the lab?
I think it was part of his change of personality changed when he saw that there were casualties. John Wheeler mentioned, he says, those people who are close to the fighting, in the Pacific, the major weapon killing people were the flamethrowers and the fire bombings of the Air Force. It was horrible then. And it's as though Oppenheimer were totally clueless about how vicious the war had been. But when he got to see the casualties that had occurred with the atomic bombings, he had this total switch of character. Now, maybe that's one reason. Also, the Soviet Union was now out of the war. So maybe that was another reason. I don't know. But anyway, he had this change. And so he went back to where he came from. He went back to Berkeley and he worked for Lawrence. And so he rejoined and he reformed his theoretical physics group in Berkeley. That's what he was doing. Okay. And then Norris Bradbury then takes over Los Alamos and he invites Teller back in, and Teller creates this group. It has George Gamow in it, Stan Ulam, really prominent physicists and mathematicians. And they work on it for a number of years until they finally do come up with a design that's tested in 1952, the Mike device. Now, meanwhile, Oppenheimer had become, the Congress had created the Atomic Energy Commission in 1946. And as part of the act, they created a General Advisory Committee, which would advise the commissioners on physics issues and nuclear weapons issues. And Oppenheimer was chosen to be the chairman of this committee called the GAC. And in that position with the GAC, Oppenheimer then used his political position to then push his own political feelings of thermonuclear research. And he kept throwing, if you will, wrenches and obstacles into the Atomic Energy Commission that made it more difficult for them to conduct their research. And it was frustrating people like Teller and others who were engaged in that. And once again, Teller finally got to a point where he just quit Los Alamos a second time and went back to Chicago. In the meantime, the Russians detonate their atomic bomb. They become a nuclear power. And some politicians now start approaching Lawrence because they go back to Berkeley and they go to Lawrence and they say, they ask him to create another laboratory to design weapons because they felt that there was not enough passion going on at Los Alamos. And Lawrence agreed. He said, they do need more passion. And he agreed, yes, it probably would be good to have a little bit of competition for that. And so he agreed to go ahead and start a second nuclear weapons laboratory. And in November 1952, that would become the Livermore Laboratory. Lawrence already had some work going on. It was an extension of his rad lab in Berkeley, basically. And in fact, the first day that Livermore opened up, it was a lot of physicists and engineers just drove over from Berkeley into Livermore. It's about a 45-minute drive. And then they create this new laboratory. And when a new laboratory is created, their first 3 tests are absolute debacles. They're all what we call fizzles. They didn't work, especially the third one, which was the thermonuclear test. And the reason was that Herb York, who had been chosen by Lawrence to lead the effort out in Livermore, Edward Teller was given a position. He would be the leader of all thermonuclear or all nuclear weapons research because he was the only one that had experience from Los Alamos. Edward, that was not his strength, and he held on to ideas from the 1940s, which were not very good. And so they had 3 failures in a row. And Bradbury back at Los Alamos, and Ruby, who is back at the Atomic Energy Commission, these other distinguished individuals were calling to shut down Livermore. That it was a bad idea. The whole idea was bad. And it was looking pretty bad, pretty stressful. And especially the 3rd test. In fact, it was so stressful that at the same time, or 2 weeks after that test, William Borden, who had been a congressional staffer for the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, had written a letter to J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, stating that Oppenheimer's wife, his mistress, and his brother were card-carrying communists, that Oppenheimer himself was actively engaged in communist activities, and most notably that Oppenheimer had lied to security investigators about attempts of the Communist Party to secure atomic secrets from him when he led the Manhattan Project. And Hoover takes that up to President Eisenhower. Eisenhower reads it, and he just gave out an executive order. Now, these are the days of the Rosenberg trial. Klaus Fuchs had just been convicted in England of being a communist spy. They had communist spies coming out of the woodwork, and Eisenhower created an executive order that any person possessing a clearance that had any kind of behavior that was suggestive of abnormal would be immediately investigated, have their clearance investigated, have their clearance revoked, and then be investigated. And clearly, Oppenheimer's behavior called for that. And so Eisenhower then ordered the Atomic Energy Commission to revoke Oppenheimer's clearance, which they did. Strauss was the commissioner, he did, and they announced it to Oppenheimer. Now, Oppenheimer knew he had lied because he would later admit it. And there was no real reason for him to hold on to a clearance. His behavior was substandard, but yet he demanded to have a hearing. He wanted to do this. Now, why would he have a hearing? He knew that it would come out that he had been lying to investigators about his connections with the Communist Party. So I don't know. It's anyone's guess why he would demand that, but he did. And so this hearing would come up, and Strauss decided to take it a step further and not only revoke his clearance, but have him declared a spy for the communists. And the reason, the evidence he would use was Oppenheimer's, the way he stymied the thermonuclear research going on in the United States, that was all part and parcel of his collaborations with the Soviet Union. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that became the thing. And so it went in. And then to get evidence of that, who is the Atomic Energy Commission going to ask but the people at Berkeley and in Livermore to testify how he'd stymied thermonuclear research. And that would include Lawrence, Louis Alvarez, a man named David Griggs, Glenn Seaborg. All of these people working at the laboratory were going to be the big witnesses. And it was very disturbing for Lawrence to have to testify against his former friend, his colleague. And on his way to give the testimony, he was accosted by several people, including one of the commissioners in the Atomic Energy Commission, that you're just being a McCarthyist, you're just going after Oppenheimer because of his fame or something. And it so upset Lawrence that evening at a banquet, he went to the bathroom and he started vomiting up blood. He called his brother, who was a doctor, and his brother heard that and ordered him immediately back to Berkeley. And so Oppenheimer was spared being a witness, but he did come up with a deposition. He wrote a deposition about how Oppenheimer had been screwing up the thermonuclear research. But Edward Teller did go in. He did give a testimony, and that was broadcast on newscast and for that performance, he was declared a McCarthyist. And for being a witness against an American hero, a declared American hero, he was pretty much ostracized by the American physics community. In fact, that upset him so much that Teller came down with an attack of colitis, just as Lawrence had, and he was hospitalized. So you had the 2 leaders of the laboratory in the hospital from stress. And Herb York, who was running operations, he came down with a thing called valley fever, and he gets bedridden. So the whole leadership of the laboratory is in bed or in the hospital. and that the picking up the weapons program from nothing, from 3 failures, fell on 2 group leaders: a 28-year-old Harold Brown, who would later be Secretary of Defense, and a 32-year-old Johnny Foster, who would later become the Director for Defense Research and Engineering. And the 2 of them were group leaders, and they came in, and within 30 days, they wrote what I call a manifesto, but they wrote a document to the engineers and scientists at the lab that we're not going to follow Edward Teller anymore. We're going to start on a new track, do our own designs. And they did. And immediately the next year, they conducted 2 tests. And in both tests, they set records and they revolutionized the design of a nuclear weapon. They were trying to make weapons much smaller because around this time, 1955, 1956, a big argument grew up in Washington. And the President Eisenhower's strategy at the time was called massive retaliation. And that is, if the Russians did some aggression in Europe, like they were planning to do, to take over Germany, then the response of the United States would be to use the entire nuclear force of the United States to attack Russia as a massive retaliation. And there were policy analysts at Livermore, working at Livermore, who disagreed with that. They said, that's not going to work for obvious reasons. And they came up with an alternative plan called Counterforce. And they really worked with the physicist at Livermore to design weapons much more smaller so that they could be much more compatible with this new Counterforce strategy, which called for not destroying cities, but going after the military strength of the Soviets. In other words, go after the ability of the Soviets to conduct war. And that's what should be your targets. Don't start targeting these cities. And that called for much more accuracy. That also, but big for Livermore, it called for making weapons much smaller. In fact, at that time, Ollie Burke became the chief of naval operations, and he suggested that one weapon we could use against the Soviets would be a submarine launching a missile from underwater. You can't sneak attack a submarine. And the reason for that is Rand Corporation had come up with a study, and they realized that if the Soviets did launch an attack in Western Europe, and to forestall the United States from launching their atomic bombs against the Soviet Union, they would go to each Strategic Air Command air base and drop an atom bomb on it and destroy all of the atomic weapons of the United States, the whole nuclear deterrent force of the United States, in one fell swoop, in a surprise attack. And the study showed they could do it. It was a year-long study, and these were big names. Andy Marshall, Herman Kahn. These were big Albert Wolfenstahl. Anyway, they came to the conclusion that the Soviets really could do this, and that started this big dilemma. And then Burke came up with the idea of, well, let's launch them from a submarine. The problem with that was a submarine missile was much smaller than an ICBM, and would require a much smaller warhead. In fact, a warhead 4 times smaller than the existing smallest warhead, which was on the Atlas. It would have to be less than 1,000 pounds. And Livermore did it. Edward Teller did stand up at the meeting and at a meeting in Massachusetts, and he told Admiral Burke that the Livermore lab could give him a warhead that would fit inside a submarine-launched missile. And in fact, they did it. By 1959, they had it. And when the Polaris was launched in 1960, each Polaris submarine had 16 Livermore warheads in it that were thermonuclear warheads, and that weapon could reach any kind of military targets within Russia. Most importantly, it could even reach Moscow. And that came on just as Kennedy became president. And right after Kennedy was inaugurated, he had a summit meeting with Khrushchev now in Vienna, Austria. And when he arrives there, Khrushchev demands, he gives Kennedy an ultimatum and demands that Kennedy remove all American forces out of Berlin because the Red Army in 6 months is going to occupy Berlin. And so Kennedy looks at him and realizes he's not going to do that. He's not going to submit 2.5 million West Germans to communism. And he comes back and his face is white. I've seen pictures of him at this time. His face is white. He comes back to his National Security Council and he says, gentlemen, we are going to have a thermonuclear war in 6 months, because he knows he's not going to pull out of Berlin. He knows the Red Army is going to come in. There's going to be fighting, and it's going to quickly escalate. He goes over to the Pentagon, and he says, he meets with General Lucius Clay, who's responsible for the defense of Germany. He says, General, what's the plan? He says, well, sir, if the Red Army invests Berlin, then we're going to have a tank-heavy task force come out of Frankfurt. and any Russian formations that come to us will have to respond with tactical nuclear weapons. And Lawrence says, and Kennedy says, okay, there is no choice for this. Kennedy issues 4 executive orders during this period, all around Berlin. And Kennedy comes back and he says, we're going to have a war. And he starts a program building fallout shelters all over the nation to protect the country because he's certain we're about to go to war. But then we have the Polaris now goes on station, and Kennedy realizes that Khrushchev knows Khrushchev can't do what he's doing without destroying himself. And that reassures Kennedy and gives him the backbone to stand up to Khrushchev and say, we're not moving. You're not taking over West Berlin. Khrushchev blinks, he takes a step back, and he builds the Berlin Wall, which then ends the crisis. So the Berlin Wall was built to stop this nuclear crisis back in 1961. And Kennedy, 6 months later, realizes how much that ability to deter Khrushchev and have a strong, reliable nuclear deterrent force, how important that was to averting that nuclear war. He flies out to Berkeley and he meets with the scientists, he meets with those physicists. And in front of a crowd of 85,000 people, he tells them that he has come to an uncomfortable truth, that he owes more to Berkeley than he does to Harvard, which is quite an admission from a Harvard graduate. And then he thanks the physicists for averting a nuclear war. And it was the first test of our deterrent strategy in the Cold War, and we passed it. And as I mentioned earlier, this crisis was more serious than the Cuban crisis. And we really almost came to total thermonuclear war, and we averted it. And Kennedy knew why we averted it. It was because we had a good, strong nuclear deterrent strategy. And it was a plan that he accepted, and it worked. And it's been working ever since. So there we go. How's that?
This episode of Nuclecast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. Yeah, that's that is it's part of the story we don't often hear. So if you read Friedman or you read some of the deterrence thinkers, you'll get sort of the strategy and the psychology, but you never hear the like real stories of the people and the things that people said and the gambles that were made and how those gambles came out and the influence of the personalities. And it's kind of hard for people. I read a lot of biography because I'm always looking for what lessons can I learn from people who have been really, really good at what they did. And one of the things that you learn about great people is that they tend to be really good at one or two things and they tend to be horrible at others. If they're a brilliant physicist, then they're a terrible parent or spouse. They can't be good at everything. And so as you look at all these, these, not just Oppenheimer, but Teller and Alvarez and Lawrence and all of these brilliant, truly brilliant people that sort of led to the greatest scientific breakthroughs of our age. They were very complicated people. And it's sort of any wonder to me that they were all able to get along well enough to make these things happen, because they are strong personalities. Yeah. Brilliant people are like that. So are there any more sort of really interesting or things that we might have never heard about the actual people and the physicists and sort of how they were? You've heard the stories. I forget which one of the rock singers that always wants M&Ms in his dressing room at a performance, but he wants like no yellow ones. Well, are there any of those great kind of stories?
Yeah. Well, within Livermore, I talk about a passing of the baton. Lawrence was this phenomenal leader in the 1940s and the early 1950s and getting the laboratory started. But he passed the baton to another generation of physicists led by Herb York. And they had their differences a little bit, but it never came out in the open because, as I think you just mentioned, they were above that. They were above that. They had, so there were kind of two camps. What I noticed was, and they were very obvious to me when I arrived at the laboratory in '81. But in one camp, you had the ultra deterrent people that did not trust the Russians 2 feet. They wouldn't trust the Russians as far as you could throw them, literally. And that was Teller. And an advocate similar to him would be Johnny Foster. Johnny Foster was similar in peace through strength kind of thing. Now, that the other camp was Herb York, Harold Brown, and Mike May. And they really wanted to get some arms control stuff going because they felt, well, we've done it. We got our deterrent force going. Now we need to get some sort of agreement with the Soviets so we quit building all these weapons and try to get some control over it. And there's a tendency among pundits and analysts and all that. But I've spoken to all of these. I've met all of those gentlemen I just mentioned. They were all strictly advocates of deterrence. There's not a doubt in their minds you needed to have a deterrent force. It was just how you applied it. They're more the way you did it. They differed, but they each respected each other. They respected each other's opinion, and they were all after the bottom line was to protect our society from a total despotic thing like the communist Russia, or now communist China. So how they handled it was spectacular. So some examples. Lawrence himself was a very much pro-strength kind of guy, but when Eisenhower asked him to lead a committee to make a test ban work, Lawrence said, yes, sir. And he worked as hard as he could to make that test ban work. And his job was to make sure we could, test it and assure it. And in the same way, people don't know this, but when we had the SALT talks in the 1970s, especially SALT 2, well, SALT 1, Harold Brown was a major architect of the SALT talks. Jimmy Carter really did rely on his Secretary of Defense, Harold Brown. Brown did that. In SALT 2, under Nixon, a major architect that set up the parameters within the Pentagon was Johnny Foster. Again, on that other side, but Johnny, given the mission, he made it work. He made it work, and although he just made sure we had a viable deterrent force, but he would fulfill the wishes of the president. So that was the kind of what I saw among these giants. I call them giants. These guys, and of course, Mike May is very active with CSAC at Stanford University, the Center for Strategic Arms Control, and others. He's been very active in that. And he and I Mike and I have even had some discussions about arms control and limits or not. But I have the utmost respect for him. He respects my opinion. And we're both after the same thing. And how exactly we achieve it may be different, but I respect him and I respect him with all my heart. So I don't know, you're right. I think your observations are right. I don't know how else to describe it, but these individuals were bigger than life. They were not, you either do it my way or no way. They would work, and they appreciated the intelligence of the other person who may be coming at it at a slightly different angle, but say, well, how can we both agree we need to deter the Soviet Union or communist China from attacking our country? How, now we may disagree how to best achieve that, but what can we do to still make the end work kind of thing? And that's a healthy, and you get the benefit of both sides doing that, if that makes sense to you.
Absolutely. So we're running out of time, but
again,
again, it always happens. But this time I am going to do what I would normally do with a guest, and that is I'm going to bring my genie Bob out. I'm going to rub my magic lamp, and of course, you get 3 wishes. Now, those wishes have to pertain to the topics we've been talking about. I mean, you can sort of wish into the future, of course. But, you can't wish for $1 billion or, a supermodel or anything like that. You got to stick to the topic. And so if you can, Bob's going to grant you those 3 wishes. What might those wishes be?
All right, Adam. As we've been talking about, we've had a nuclear deterrent for 72 years now, and it works. It was designed to deter a massive missile attack over the North Pole coming to our country. And it works. It works really well. Today, we have a Xi Jinping regime in China. We have a Putin regime in Russia. And both of them, in their military journals, have said that a tactical nuclear weapon would not necessarily start World War III. And we should all feel very troubled about that. That's an extremely troubling statement for them to make. Now, our nuclear deterrent force did not deter Putin from invading Ukraine. It's not going to deter Xi Jinping from invading Taiwan. And so my wish is that we would have the wherewithal, the energy, and the determination to come to grips with we have to develop a deterrent force that will deter those two despots from starting a regional conflict that could easily grow into a thermonuclear war.
Okay, so wish number one. What's your next wish?
That's kind of a big one.
Yeah, that's a big one. But you got two more.
If I got that one, that would serve me well. And then it's either a cold beer or something else. After that, nothing else counts for me.
Once you save the world, you just have a cold beer.
Yeah, then you can give me a cold beer, make my kegerator work better, something like that.
Yeah, it's if assuming Bob would give me your wishes, I would wish that Americans better understood this element of history so that they could understand it, they could know it, they could know what it meant for them. And I often tell people that we've heard about the $1 trillion triad and we can't afford it. And I say, well, hey, wait a second. That's malarkey, because Medicare and Medicaid lose $70 to $80 billion a year in waste, fraud, and abuse. That's far more than we spend on nuclear weapons. And it's far more than it would take to modernize everything. But yet you don't even know we lose that much. And so the simple fact is we can afford all of it. We can afford what we're doing and more, and not even blink an eye, because the federal government spends so much money on so many wasteful things that this is something that, relatively speaking, it's prevented great power war. It's made our allies be less willing to go to war. It's saved countless lives. It's reduced defense budgets, because when you're not fighting great power conventional wars, you spend less on war. And what it's done is it's allowed the United States to then take all those resources we're not spending. World War II was half the GDP of the country. And then we can go invent iPhones. And then we can buy, we have this wealth to where we live in, the houses are more than twice as big as they were in 1945. We've got more cars, we've got televisions, we've got cell phones, we've got so much stuff that now we're all unhappy because we've got too much stuff. But I would say nuclear weapons and the peace and the stability and the reduction in expenditures they provide have enabled that to happen. And I wish people understood the role nuclear weapons played in shaping, our prosperous present. That would be my wish. I'd steal your wish if Bob would let me do that.
Sure. Great, Adam.
Certainly
that would be great.
Let me remind everybody, from Berkeley to Berlin, Tom Ramos. And, it's a great book written by somebody who's spent decades on the job doing it and knew many of these folks and, experienced it himself and talked to the participants and the players. So grab a copy of the book, read it, educate yourself on this history. And of course, Tom, thanks for coming on NucleCast. Thanks for telling us this history.
My pleasure, Adam. It's my pleasure.
And thanks to you, the listeners. Hopefully you've enjoyed episode 1 and episode 2. They were great episodes to talk about Oppenheimer, to talk about some of this forgotten history, and I found it interesting. So hopefully you did too. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on NucleCast.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrent Center, a 501c3 that seeks to educate key decision makers, stakeholders, and the public to ensure a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrent. Our executive producer is Kimberly Tim, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Grunfeld. Help us grow our followers by sharing it and follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter